Сентябрь 1944 года. Северная Франция. Где-то между Лионом и ничем. A Sherman tank sits alone in a field, engine off, gun cold. The crew has been out of contact with their battalion for 11 hours. They are lost. They have no infantry support, no artillery on call, no air cover, no orders except the last ones they received before the radio died, which told them to push east and hold whatever they found. There are 5 of them. The village ahead has a garrison. What happens next is the kind of story that survives because the Germans wrote it down too. Not because it was a great victory, not because it involved brilliant tactics or overwhelming firepower, but because when German officers tried to reconstruct the sequence of events afterward, tried to explain how a single Allied tank crew without infantry support, without communications, without a clear plan, managed to capture and hold an entire fortified village, they kept arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. They couldn't explain it. Not fully. Not in a way that fit their doctrine. Not in a way that accounted for every decision the crew made, or failed to make, or made by accident. The German after-action report, which survives in fragmentary form, uses the word unorthodox 3 times in 4 pages. That word, in a German military document from 1944, 1944, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. To understand what happened in that field, on that road, in that village, you need to understand what a lost Sherman crew actually was, what they were trained to do, what they were not trained to do, what the machine they were sitting inside could and could not accomplish. And you need to understand what the Germans had waiting for them, what doctrine, what weapons, what assumptions, and why all of those assumptions turned out to be wrong in exactly the right sequence. Because this story is not really about bravery. It is about a series of small decisions made by exhausted men in a steel box, and the way those decisions compounded into something that neither side could have predicted. Часть первая. The machine and the men inside it. To understand the crew, you have to understand the tank. And to understand the tank, you have to understand the argument that produced it. The M4 Sherman medium tank entered production in February of 1942, 1942, at the Lima Locomotive Works in Lima, Ohio. By the end of the war, American factories would produce 49,234 of them. That number matters. Hold it. The Sherman was not the best tank of the Second World War by almost any technical metric. Its armor was thinner than the Panther's. Its main gun, the 75mm M3 in its early variants, was outclassed by the German long 75 and catastrophically outclassed by the 88. At combat range, a Panther could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at 1,000 meters. A Sherman needed to close to under 500 meters to have a reliable chance of penetrating a Panther's front plate, and even then, it was not guaranteed. The German nickname for the Sherman was Tommy Cooker. British crews called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, because of its advertising slogan, "Lights first time, every time." The fuel system was redesigned after the North Africa campaign. The fires became less frequent. The nickname stayed. Stop and think about that for a moment. The men who fought in these machines knew what the machines were. They knew the kill ratios. They knew what happened to crews who took an 88 round through the hull. They climbed in anyway, every morning, because the alternative was walking. But here is what the Sherman had that the Panther did not. It had 49,000 siblings. The American armored doctrine of the Second World War was not built on the idea of tank versus tank supremacy. It was built on the idea of mass, mobility, and maintenance. A Sherman could be repaired in the field with tools a trained mechanic could carry in a half-track. A Panther required specialist workshops and parts that had to come from factories being bombed around the clock. A Sherman crew could be trained in weeks to a functional combat standard. A Panther crew required months of specialist instruction. The man who understood this most clearly was General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces, who oversaw the development of American armored doctrine from 1941 onward. McNair argued, and the argument is documented in Army Ground Forces Study No. 20, published in 1946, that tanks were not primarily meant to fight other tanks. That was the job of tank destroyers. Tanks were for exploitation, for penetration, for cutting supply lines and disrupting command and control. The job of a Sherman was not to kill a tiger. The job of a Sherman was to go somewhere fast and make trouble. McNair was killed in July of 1944 by American bombs during Operation Cobra, which is a different story. But his doctrine was very much alive in September of that same year, and it was sitting in the heads of the 5 men in that field outside that village. Now meet those men. Or rather, meet the one whose name survived in the documents. Staff Sergeant Harold Fenwick Collis, 24 years old, from Cranford, New Jersey, a small borough of roughly 12,000 people sitting between Newark and the Watchung Mountains. Before the war, Collis worked at a dry cleaning shop on Centennial Avenue, where his uncle was the manager. He enlisted in January of 1942, 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, was assigned to the 2nd Armored Division, and by the summer of 1944 had been in continuous combat since the Normandy breakout. He was the tank commander. The names of the other 4 crew members, the driver, the assistant driver, the loader, and the gunner, do not appear in the surviving documents with the same clarity. The after-action report filed by Collis's company commander, Captain Raymond Shea of the 2nd Armored Division's 66th Armored Regiment, refers to them collectively as Collis's crew, and notes that all 5 men were present and functional at the time of the after-action interview. We know the gunner's surname was Wierzbicki, because Collis mentions him by name twice in his own statement. We know the driver was from somewhere in the South, because Collis describes him, in his statement, as the one who talks like he's got all day. That is the extent of what the documents give us. 5 men, 1 tank, 11 hours out of contact. Here is what they were carrying: a full load of 75mm ammunition, 97 rounds in the standard stowage configuration, 2 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 1 coaxial and 1 in the bow, a Thompson submachine gun per man, which was standard crew equipment but which was not always actually present in practice because the Thompsons had a habit of disappearing in the supply chain. Collis's statement confirms they had 3 Thompsons between 5 men, which was better than average. They had 2 cases of K rations and 1 partial case of C rations. They had a broken radio, specifically the SCR 508 radio set had a cracked crystal in the transmitter, which meant they could receive but not send. They had been receiving intermittent traffic for the past 4 hours, but nothing they could act on. They were low on fuel. Collis estimated in his statement that they had enough for approximately 40 miles of road travel, maybe 25 cross-country. They were not, by any reasonable military standard, in a position to attack anything. The village was called something. The name in the surviving documents is partially obscured by water damage on the original page, and the letter that begins the name is unclear. For the purposes of this investigation, we will call it what Collis called it in his statement: the village on the hill. This is not a romantic description. The village was literally on a hill. It had a church, a square, approximately 60 to 80 stone buildings, 2 roads in and 2 roads out, and, according to German records, a garrison of between 30 and 40 Wehrmacht soldiers from a rear area security unit supported by at least 1 anti-tank gun. 1 anti-tank gun against 1 Sherman. On paper, this was not a contest. Часть вторая. What the Germans had and why it should have been enough. The unit holding the village was a detachment from Landesschützenbataillon, a home guard battalion in the terminology of the period. These were not front-line combat troops. They were older men, many of them in their late 30s and early 40s, assigned to rear area security duties, guarding supply depots, maintaining order in occupied territory, escorting prisoners. Their average age was 38. Their commanding officer was an Oberleutnant, a first lieutenant, whose name appears in the German records as Brandt, with no first name recorded. Do not mistake rear area security for harmless. These men had weapons. They had been in the war for years, some of them since Poland in 1939. They knew how to use a rifle. They knew how to use an anti-tank weapon. And they had something that Collis's crew did not have. They were in prepared defensive positions, inside stone buildings, with fields of fire covering both approach roads. The anti-tank weapon they had is worth a close look. The surviving German records describe it as a PaK-36, a 37mm anti-tank gun. This is the critical technical fact of this entire story, so hold it carefully. The PaK-36 had been the standard German anti-tank gun at the start of the war. By 1944, it was almost completely obsolete. Against the armor of a Sherman, which had a front hull plate of 51mm of rolled, homogeneous armor, a PaK-36, firing standard armor-piercing ammunition at combat range, could not reliably penetrate. At 300 meters, the PaK-36's armor-piercing round would produce approximately 42mm of penetration against vertical plate. The Sherman's front hull plate was 51mm. At that range, the gun could not kill the tank through the front. The sides were a different matter. The Sherman's side armor was 38mm. A PaK-36 could penetrate that at 300 meters. The rear was worse, 38mm as well, and at closer ranges even more vulnerable. Brandt knew this. The German records make clear that Brandt had positioned his gun to cover the main approach road, the road that ran straight into the village square from the west. His reasoning was documented. He expected any Allied armor to approach on the road, which would present the front of the vehicle to his gun. He knew his gun could not kill a Sherman head-on. His plan was to disable it, to knock out a track or to force it to stop, and then use his infantry to close with it and destroy it with Panzerfauste. He had 4 Panzerfaust rounds, not 4 launchers, 4 complete single-shot Panzerfaust disposable launchers, each one capable, if it hit in the right place, of killing a Sherman. 4 shots against 1 tank. The plan was not insane. It was, in fact, a reasonable improvisation given the resources available. Stop the tank on the road, hit it with Panzerfauste from the flanks and rear while it was immobilized and confused. Hold the position until relief arrived. Relief was not coming. Brandt almost certainly did not know this. The German front in this sector had been collapsing in fragments since late August, and the communication networks that would have told Brandt his situation were the same communication networks that had been collapsing with it. He was, in his own way, as isolated as Collis. Here is the thing that the German after-action report, written by a staff officer who interviewed Brandt after the fact, identifies as the central problem. Brandt's plan assumed the Sherman would approach on the road. It did not approach on the road. Meet Oberleutnant Brandt for a moment. The records give us almost nothing about him personally. We know he was over 40. The document describes him as älteren Dienstgrades, meaning senior in age for his rank, which in context implies he was older than typical for a first lieutenant. We know he had been in the army since at least 1940, based on the service ribbon notation in his file. We know he was from somewhere in Bavaria, because the staff officer who wrote the after-action report notes that Brandt's dialect was Bayerisch. He was a professional soldier of the old pattern, methodical, careful, trained to defend what he was given, and hold it until orders changed. He had never fought a tank crew that didn't know where it was going. The 11 hours and what they produced. Here is what Collis's crew had been doing for those 11 hours. They had been following a stream. This sounds absurd until you understand why. After losing radio contact and becoming separated from their column during a night movement, Collis had made a decision that he describes in his statement with characteristic brevity. "I figured if we followed the water, we'd end up somewhere." This is not military doctrine. This is not in any training manual. This is a 24-year-old from Cranford, New Jersey, applying the logic of a Boy Scout to a 66,000-pound machine in the dark. The stream had taken them south and east, away from the main axis of advance, through terrain that was not on their tactical map, or rather, was on the map but had not been reconnoitered. The terrain was soft in places, and the Sherman had bogged twice during the night. Both times Collis had gotten out, assessed the situation, and found a way around. By dawn, they were in a position that nobody, not their battalion, not the Germans, had anticipated. They were approaching the village from the northeast. Collis saw the village at approximately 0600 hours. He stopped the tank at the tree line, approximately 400 meters from the nearest buildings, and observed for 40 minutes. This is documented in his statement. "We sat and watched for about 40 minutes before I decided anything." 40 minutes of observation before moving. This is, it turns out, good practice. It is also not what a lost, exhausted crew in a cold tank with dwindling fuel would be expected to do. What Collis observed in those 40 minutes: smoke from cooking fires in the village, which told him the garrison was awake and active. 2 soldiers visible at what appeared to be a guard post on the southern road. No visible anti-tank weapons on the northeast approach. The road approaching from the west, which he could partially see from his position, appeared to have some kind of prepared position near the first buildings, though he could not identify it precisely. He did not know about the Pak 36. He did not know about the 4 Panzerfauste. He did not know how many men were in the village. His estimate, as recorded in his statement, was maybe 20, maybe more. What he did know was this: he had enough fuel to get in, but possibly not enough to get out if things went wrong. He had a working gun and a full ammunition load. He had 3 Thompsons and 5 men who had been awake for most of the past 36 hours. And he had the northeast approach, which appeared undefended. Collis made a decision. He decided to go in fast, not because this was the correct tactical decision by the book. The correct tactical decision by the book was to withdraw, find higher ground, attempt to re-establish radio contact, and wait for support. Collis knew this. His statement acknowledges it with a directness that is almost uncomfortable to read. "I knew we should have pulled back, but I didn't know if we had the fuel to get anywhere useful, and I figured if we sat there long enough, someone was going to spot us anyway." This is the logic of the irreversible. When all your options are bad, speed becomes its own kind of strategy. At 0640, Collis gave the order to advance. The Sherman came out of the tree line at speed. The driver, whose name we still don't have, pushed the Ford GAA-V8 engine to its limit on the approach, and the tank covered the 400 meters to the first buildings in approximately 45 seconds. This is not a guess. This is calculable from the Sherman's maximum road speed of approximately 47 kilometers per hour and the distance involved. 45 seconds from tree line to village edge. In 45 seconds, the German garrison had to hear the engine, identify it as a tank, determine it was coming from the northeast rather than the west, communicate this to Brandt and to the anti-tank gun crew, and reposition the Pak 36 to cover the northeast approach. The Pak 36 weighed 440 kilograms in firing position. Moving it required unhooking it from its travel position, manhandling it, and re-emplacing it. In ideal conditions, with a trained crew, this took approximately 90 seconds. They had 45. Reread that. The German gun crew did not have time to move the gun. The gun was positioned to cover the western road. The Sherman came from the northeast. The gun never fired. This was not brilliant planning by Collis. He did not know where the gun was. He did not know it was a PaK-36. He did not know it was positioned to cover the western road. He chose the northeast approach because it looked undefended, which it was, but not for the reason he thought. It was undefended because Brandt had concentrated his defense on the expected approach, and Collis was not expected. The Sherman entered the village square at approximately 0642. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Collis did not immediately open fire. His statement is explicit about this, and it is one of the details that the German after-action report also notes with evident puzzlement. The Allied tank entered the square and halted. It did not fire immediately. The German document records a pause of several minutes, which Collis's statement clarifies as approximately 3 minutes, during which the Sherman sat in the middle of the village square with its engine running and its gun traversed toward the church. 3 minutes. What was Collis doing for 3 minutes? He was looking. He describes it in his statement. I stopped in the square because I needed to see what we had. I had Wierzbicki traverse the gun around slow, and I was up in the hatch watching. I wanted to see where they were before I started shooting, because once you start shooting in a place like that, you can't take it back. You can't take it back. A 24-year-old dry cleaning shop employee from Cranford, New Jersey, sitting in the hatch of a Sherman tank in a village square somewhere in France, applying the same logic to combat that a careful surgeon applies to an operation. Look before you cut, because once you cut, you can't uncut. What he saw in those 3 minutes. German soldiers emerging from buildings, not charging, not attacking, but appearing, looking, trying to understand what was happening. The garrison had been prepared for an attack from the west. They had woken up to the sound of a tank engine coming from the wrong direction, and the tank was now sitting in their square, and it was not firing, and nobody was sure what to do. Brandt was not in the square. Brandt was at his command post, which was in a building on the western edge of the village near the PaK-36. He had heard the tank enter from the northeast. He was trying to communicate with his men via runner. His field telephone line to the square had been cut at some point, possibly by the tank crossing it during the approach, possibly earlier. For approximately 3 minutes, the German garrison and Collis's crew were in the same village, looking at each other, and nobody was shooting. And then, Wierzbicki fired the coaxial machine gun into the air. Not at anyone, not at any target, into the air. Collis's statement, I told Wierzbicki to fire a burst into the air just to make some noise. I wanted them to know the gun worked. The burst, approximately 20 rounds of .30 caliber, lasted less than 2 seconds. It produced a sound that everyone in the village could hear. It produced no casualties. It produced something else. It broke the paralysis. 3 German soldiers came out of a building near the church with their hands up. Then 2 more. Then a group of 4. Collis, in his hatch, with a Thompson submachine gun he was not pointing at anyone in particular, accepted their surrender. He had no idea what to do with prisoners. He had no infantry. He had 4 men inside the tank who could not leave it without the tank becoming unmanned. He directed the surrendering soldiers, through gestures because none of the crew spoke German, to sit against the church wall. They sat. More came out. By 0715, approximately 22 German soldiers were sitting against the church wall in the village square. The PaK-36 had not fired. The Panzerfäuste had not been used. Brandt was still at his command post on the western edge of the village. Here is what Collis did not know. Brandt had approximately 15 men still under his direct control, including the anti-tank gun crew and the soldiers with the Panzerfäuste. Brandt had the capability to destroy the Sherman. He had the firepower. He had the position. He did not use it. Why? The German after-action report addresses this question at length. Brandt's own account, as recorded by the staff officer who interviewed him, gives several reasons. The first is tactical. His gun was positioned to cover the western road, and moving it under fire, or under the threat of fire from a tank that was already inside the village, was suicidal. The second is situational. He had no communication with most of his men, and he did not know how many had already surrendered. The third is psychological, and it is the one that the staff officer seems to have found most significant. Brandt had expected an attack. He had prepared for an attack. What arrived was not an attack in any form he recognized. A single tank, moving fast, entering the square, stopping, and waiting. Brandt's account uses the word unheimlich, uncanny, eerie, unsettling. He did not know what to do with a tank that was not attacking. His training, his doctrine, his years of experience. All of it was calibrated for an enemy that was trying to kill him. An enemy that stopped in his square and waited was outside his categories. And while Brandt was trying to recategorize, his men were surrendering. At 0730, Kallas sent his assistant driver, one of the two men who could theoretically leave the tank for short periods without completely compromising the crew's combat capability, to walk to the western edge of the village and determine what was there. This was a significant risk. A man on foot, alone, in a village with armed German soldiers who had not yet surrendered, was extremely vulnerable. Kallas's reasoning, as recorded, "I needed to know what was on the other side before I could do anything about it." The assistant driver, we will call him by the description Kallas gives him, the kid from somewhere south, walked to the western edge and found Brandt. Brandt was standing next to his Pak 36. He had 5 men with him. He had the 4 Panzerfaust. He had a pistol in his hand. The assistant driver had a Thompson. They looked at each other. The assistant driver, according to Kallas's statement, said, "Sir, I think you ought to come with me." Brandt came with him. The German after-action report does not record what Brandt said about this moment, but it records what the staff officer observed. Brandt was, in the staff officer's words, erschöpft und desorientiert, exhausted and disoriented. He had been awake for most of the previous 48 hours. His communications were gone. His men had surrendered without fighting. His gun had never fired. His plan had not failed in any way he could point to. It had simply become irrelevant before he could execute it. He surrendered because there was nothing left to defend. By 0800 hours, Kallas's crew held the village. 31 German soldiers were prisoners. The Pak 36 was intact and undamaged. The 4 Panzerfauste were recovered unfired. American casualties? 0. German casualties? 0. No one had been killed. Часть четвертая. The forensic verdict. Here is what the forensic verdict of this investigation looks like. The capture of the village on the hill was not a tactical masterpiece. It was not a product of superior training, superior equipment, or superior planning. It was a product of a specific sequence of accidents, decisions, and failures, on both sides, that compounded in a direction that nobody planned and nobody could have reliably replicated. Start with the accidents. The broken radio was an accident. Without it, Kallas would have been in contact with his battalion, would have received orders, and would almost certainly not have been in that field at dawn. The stream was an accident. Or rather, following the stream was a decision born from an accident. And it produced a line of approach that no German defender had anticipated. The cracked crystal in the SCR-508 transmitter was a manufacturing defect, or a combat damage, and it changed the geometry of the entire engagement. Now the decisions. Kallas's decision to observe for 40 minutes before moving was not doctrine. It was instinct or caution, or exhaustion, producing a kind of forced patience. But it gave him information. Specifically, the absence of visible anti-tank weapons on the northeast approach that shaped everything that followed. His decision to enter fast was born from the logic of limited fuel, not from tactical calculation. His decision to stop in the square and not immediately fire was the most consequential decision of the engagement, and it was made, by his own account, from a desire not to destroy something he might not need to destroy. This last point deserves to be held. In a doctrine built on firepower and mass, in an army that had been trained to use overwhelming force at every opportunity, a 24-year-old staff sergeant made the decision to not shoot because he wanted to see what he had first. This is not what the Army trained him to do. The Army trained him to use his weapons. He chose not to, and that choice, that specific restraint in that specific moment, is what gave the German soldiers in the square the space to surrender without feeling they were being executed. If Collis had opened fire when he entered the square, the engagement would have been a firefight. The Germans in the buildings would have fought back. The Pak-36 might have been moved and brought to bear. The Panzerfaust would have been used. 5 men in a Sherman against 35 armed soldiers in prepared positions inside stone buildings is not a favorable engagement for the 5 men. The restraint was the weapon. Now the failures. Specifically, Brandt's failures. And here the German after-action report is unusually frank. Brandt's plan was not wrong given his resources. Positioning the Pak-36 to cover the main approach road was the correct decision. Having infantry with Panzerfaust as a backup was the correct decision. But the plan had a single point of failure. It assumed the enemy would use the road. Brandt had no contingency for an approach from the northeast, because the northeast approach, through soft ground, through terrain not reconnoitered, across a stream, was not a rational military route. No trained tank crew following standard doctrine would have approached from that direction. Collis was not following standard doctrine. He was following a stream. The staff officer who wrote the German after-action report understood this. His conclusion, in the original German, is worth rendering carefully. Der Feind handelte ohne erkennbare taktische Methode, und eben diese Methodenlosigkeit machte seine Handlungen unvorhersehbar. The enemy acted without recognizable tactical method, and precisely this lack of method made his actions unpredictable. This is the most honest sentence in the document. A system designed to defeat a rational enemy, a system built on doctrine, on anticipated approaches, on the logic of trained soldiers following trained procedures, encountered something it was not designed to defeat. Not a genius, not a superhuman, a tired man in a lost tank, making the decisions that seemed most survivable in the moment, without reference to doctrine, because he didn't know where he was or what the doctrine said to do when you were here. There is a broader pattern here that the German report does not articulate, but that the evidence points toward. By September of 1944, the German rear area security apparatus in northern France was collapsing. Units like Brandt's were cut off, under-equipped, and operating without reliable communication. They were holding positions not because the positions were defensible, but because they had orders to hold them, and no orders to withdraw. The war of maneuver that the Wehrmacht had been built for, the war of blitzkrieg and encirclement and the Schwerpunkt, was over. What remained was a war of attrition, of improvisation, of men trying to apply the lessons of 1939 to the realities of 1944. Brandt had a plan. The plan required the enemy to behave predictably. The enemy did not behave predictably. The plan became irrelevant. This is not unique to this engagement. It is the story of the German war in the West from August of 1944 onward, told in miniature, in one village, by 5 men in one tank. Now the aftermath. Collis and his crew held the village for approximately 4 hours before elements of their battalion arrived and took over the prisoners. The after-action report filed by Captain Shea describes the situation at the handover. 31 prisoners, 1 intact anti-tank gun, 4 Panzerfauste, small arms, ammunition, and supplies. He notes, with evident understatement, that Collis's crew had accomplished more than could reasonably have been expected given their situation. Harold Fenwick Collis was awarded the Silver Star for the action. The citation, which is in the public record, describes the engagement in language that is considerably more heroic than Collis's own account. Collis's account, as recorded in Captain Shea's report, ends with a sentence that has stayed with every researcher who has found it. "I just didn't want to shoot anybody I didn't have to." He survived the war. He was discharged in November of 1945. He returned to Cranford, New Jersey, and worked for the rest of his working life at a hardware store on Centennial Avenue, 2 blocks from the dry cleaning shop where he had worked before the war. He died in 1989 at the age of 69. He is buried in Cranford. Oberleutnant Brandt's fate after the surrender is not recorded in the documents available for this investigation. He passes out of the historical record at the moment he walks with the assistant driver back to the village square. Wierzbicki, the gunner who fired the burst into the air, the 2 seconds of noise that broke the paralysis, is mentioned once more in Collis's statement at the very end in a context that is not about the battle at all. Collis writes, "Wierzbicki kept asking me afterward if I thought it counted as a victory. I told him I thought it counted as us still being alive, which was the same thing." We do not know Wierzbicki's first name. We do not know where he was from. We do not know if he came home. Here is the mid-roll moment for this investigation. Men like Harold Collis did not write memoirs. They went back to hardware stores. They answered questions when someone asked, and stopped talking about it when no one did. The after-action report that preserves his words exists because a company commander named Raymond Shea thought it was worth writing down, and because the paper survived in a box somewhere for 80 years. The German after-action report exists because a staff officer took the time to interview an exhausted Oberleutnant who had just surrendered his garrison without firing a shot, and wrote down what he said, honestly. If this investigation gives you a clearer picture of what the autumn of 1944 actually looked like for the men who were in it, not the version in the campaign histories, but the version where a guy follows a stream because he doesn't know what else to do and ends up in a village square, deciding not to shoot, press the like button. It keeps this kind of story visible a little longer, and that matters. Now back to the verdict. The question the German after-action report was trying to answer: how did a single tank crew capture an entire village? Has, by this point, an answer. But the answer is not the one the staff officer was looking for. He was looking for a tactical explanation. He wanted to find the maneuver, the deception, the clever use of terrain or firepower that explained the outcome. He could not find it because it was not there. The explanation is simpler and stranger than any tactical maneuver. Collis's crew captured the village because they were lost, because a radio broke, because a man followed a stream in the dark, because he stopped and watched for 40 minutes when every instinct of an exhausted soldier would have said move, because he entered fast when the fuel situation said he couldn't afford to be slow, because he stopped in the square and didn't shoot when the training said shoot, because his gunner fired into the air instead of into the buildings when the target presented itself. Every one of these things was, in isolation, either an accident or a deviation from doctrine. Together, they produced an outcome that doctrine could not have produced. The enemy acted without recognizable tactical method, and precisely this lack of method made his actions unpredictable. The German army in September of 1944 was still, in many respects, the finest tactical military organization in the world. Its doctrine was sophisticated. Its training was rigorous. Its soldiers were experienced. And it was losing, systematically, to an army that was less sophisticated, less rigorous, and often less experienced, but that was producing in sufficient quantity men like Harold Collis, men who, when the doctrine ran out, improvised, not brilliantly, not heroically in any cinematic sense, but practically, survivably, with a specific kind of American pragmatism that asked not, "What does the manual say?" but, "What can I actually do with what I actually have?" 49,234 Shermans. Hold that number again. Not because each one was a masterpiece of engineering. They weren't. Not because each crew was a tactical genius. They weren't that either. But because inside each one was a version of the same calculation. I don't know exactly where I am or exactly what's ahead, but I have this machine and these men and this amount of fuel, and I am going to figure out something. Brandt had a plan. Collis had a stream. The stream worked. Go back to that village square for a moment. 0642 in the morning, September of 1944. A Sherman sitting in the middle of a stone square in northern France, engine running, gun traversing slowly, the commander in the hatch watching. 22 German soldiers sitting against a church wall. A Pak-36 on the other side of the village that never fired. 4 Panzerfauste that were never used. And a 24-year-old from Cranford, New Jersey, looking at the men sitting against the wall, deciding not to shoot anybody he didn't have to. The German after-action report uses the word unorthodox 3 times. It is the right word. It just does not go far enough. What Collis did was not unorthodox in the sense of being a clever variation on orthodox practice. It was unorthodox in the sense of being outside any practice at all, the product of a man making decisions in real time, in an unfamiliar place, with broken equipment, without orders, and getting it right by following something that had nothing to do with doctrine. He followed the water. He ended up somewhere. That somewhere, it turned out, was a village that needed capturing. I just didn't want to shoot anybody I didn't have to. That sentence, written in a company after-action report that almost nobody has read, is the most precise description of what the autumn of 1944 actually was for the men who were in it. Not the maps, not the operational histories, not the campaign medals. One man, in one tank, in one square, making the smallest possible version of the largest possible decision. Don't shoot what you don't have to shoot. He got it right.